So last night I was doing my nearly nightly rewatch of the Amazing Spider-Man movies, and I want to go ahead and talk about my general thoughts about this movie because this is one of the more confusing blockbusters that I could remember watching, and there's a lot of great stuff in here. There's genuinely a great Spider-Man movie in here. Like, you can see it, you can feel it in some scenes, but then other scenes you're like, what, how did this pass? How did this go through a board, and how did this pass as a movie? And it's really confusing, and I think that the reason for this though is pretty simple. The movie doesn't know what story it wants to tell. When I go back to The Amazing Spider-Man 2, the first thing that stands out to me is obviously how good this movie looks. Marc Webb clearly has a visual style for these movies. The first film I didn't really love as much. I do feel like it was a little too dark, and that might just be because of the time it was in, that 2011 time frame with the Dark Knight trilogy and everything. People were trying to go dark and mimic Nolan, but I think this movie does feel a lot brighter, and I do love just the vibrant and the sunny nature of New York. When Andrew is swinging around, it does feel like a real city, and the lightning mimics that. I think it is a beautiful movie. Another thing in the movie, like Andrew Garfield, obviously we know this, he's incredible in this movie, right? This is peak Spider-Man in my opinion. His quips are off the charts here, and some people might argue that it's a little over the top, but I think it's just right. I think it's perfect, and this is the closest we've gotten to that fast talking, always moving Spider-Man in the comics. And then you get into like the Peter-Gwen dynamic, right? I think this is still to me the best live action Spider-Man relationship. I mean, it helps that Andrew and Emma Stone were dating in real life, but that's clearly felt through the screen here and in a way we haven't seen in any movie since then. The little awkwardness in their conversations, the breakup scene, them getting back together, everything feels very earned in their relationship. But I do wonder if the movie relies a little too much on that. If they kind of just say, all right, Andrew, Emma, we're going to keep the cameras rolling and you guys just go with it. I wonder if that does take up too much of this movie. But however, moments like the graduation speech or Peter constantly going back and forth on whether he should be with her or not, they all land. And that is the driving plot of this movie, and I loved it. And of course, that means that you're going to get so invested with these people that when we get to Gwen's death scene, it feels perfect. To me, the slow motion and the symbolism of Peter's web reaching out like a hand and the sound design dropping out, it's all executed so well. It's emotional and it's tragic, and it's easily one of the biggest moments of the film because they did do a great job of building that relationship up so properly. But to me, I think this movie struggles because I think a lot of the times we build up to these big moments, but we forget about everything in between. And I think that's why a lot of people have revisionist history when it comes to this movie, because a lot of the times they're able to just kind of nitpick and say, oh, well, this is the best Spider-Man moment we've had, or this is the best Gwen moment we've had. And they don't really remember how we got there. And to me, movie making is all about the in-between. You can't just jump from big action sequence to big action sequence and not remember like the actual character development that's going unseen. And these movies, especially this one, really struggle with that. But one of the small moments that it does get right is when Peter is helping the kid that's being bullied. That is Spider-Man. That's the character at its core, and for a while it does feel like this movie really does understand that, especially in the first 30 minutes or so, but then everything else starts happening and I believe this movie gets really bogged down. So let's go ahead and go back to the opening scene for a second, because I think it does represent perfectly everything in this movie, because it does some things right, but it also does some things catastrophically wrong. On paper, it's a great Spider-Man sequence with Spidey swinging through New York. You have some incredible shots of that sexy suit. You have some great quips from Andrew, but there's also the moment that everybody loves to talk about, and it's Spidey just joking with the Rhino, having fun. But if you actually look at what's happening, Rhino is destroying the city. Cars are flipping, people are in danger, and Peter is kind of playing around. And that for me is where this movie starts to feel tonally off, because the movie wants Spider-Man to feel very light and very funny, but the situation is pretty serious, and that disconnect shows up a lot throughout the entire film. And I think that's really the core issue here, is that this movie has an identity crisis. It doesn't know what it wants to be. Is it a grounded, emotional story about Peter Parker dealing with love and loss? Or is it a big, colorful comic book movie with multiple villains trying to set up a Sinister Six? And is it about spectacle? It tries to be both, and it never really fully commits to either. You'll go from this quiet, emotional scene between Peter and Gwen straight into something like Electro just talking to himself in a mirror and baking himself a cake for his birthday, and the shift is just really jarring, and it does honestly take you out of the movie a little bit. And speaking of Electro, we got to talk about the villains in this movie, because this is where the movie really falls apart. There are just too many. You just got You got Electro, you get Harry Osborn, you get the Green Goblin, you've got Rhino, and then on top of that, you got the whole Peter's parents storyline. It's just a lot packed into one movie. And Electro should have just been the one villain we get in this movie. We should have slow played the whole Harry turning into the Goblin. I think that this movie is just clearly building towards most of this movie, trying to set up that Sinister Six, but it forgets about the movie having one villain that we should just be building up towards for most of its runtime. Jamie Foxx is a great actor, but here this performance just felt way too campy. It feels exaggerated, almost cartoonish, and it doesn't match the tone of this movie. And then there's Harry Osborn. This is probably my biggest issue in this movie because his entire arc just feels so rushed. His relationship with Peter doesn't make any sense. It's just not developed enough. We just are supposed to drop in this story and believe that, oh, these guys have been friends, but they just weren't really talking in the first movie, and it just doesn't feel very fleshed out. His illness just feels like a plot device, and his transformation into the Goblin happens way too fast, like this movie just needed it to happen, and that's a problem. When that moment leads directly to Gwen's death, it should feel a little bit more earned, but instead it just feels like a scheduled thing that has to happen, I guess. And then there's the Rhino. I know Paul Giamatti is clearly having fun, but it doesn't really fit into this movie. He's just way too over the top, and it feels like something out of a completely different movie. And again, it just adds to the feeling that this movie doesn't know what it wants to be. And the Peter parents storyline subplot is just awful in these movies. I don't understand why Marc Webb felt the need to really focus on that so much. Spider-Man has always been better when Peter's parents are sort of a mystery. That's part of what makes him relatable. And the movie tries to turn his parents into this huge conspiracy, and it doesn't really add anything meaningful to the story. It just takes away from the stuff that matters, like the opening sequence of them in that jet. I think every time I rewatch this movie, I just want to skip through that and get to Andrew flying through New York City. It's just one of the more pointless scenes in the Spider-Man movies. But I do have a reasoning for why this feels so tonally weird in this movie, because you can feel two different movies happening at the same time, and that is because you can feel Marc Webb's movie, the grounded, emotional story about Peter and Gwen, but you can also feel the studio pulling for a more villainous, having to set up the Sinister Six, the just universe building, and it creates this constant tug of war that really is, like I said, very jarring from scene to scene. Because this movie is obsessed with setting up the future. You've got Oscorp teasing multiple villains at the end. You've got all these hints at what's coming next, but none of it actually serves the story we're watching. And that to me is just very unfair to Andrew, because these movies never happened. So we're really setting up stuff that does not matter, and it's just taking away from this great Spider-Man performance that we got. But despite all that, Andrew Garfield, fantastic in this movie. I think to me he's the best Spider-Man actor. Just in general, he's an incredible actor. And after Gwen's death in this movie, I don't think we talk about how great he is in the second half, because after Gwen dies, you can just feel the weight on him, and there's a real sadness there. And the ending when he disappears for a while and then comes back as Spider-Man, that works. It feels like somebody who is broken and trying to find his way again, and that's what makes this movie very frustrating, because all the pieces are there. A great Spider-Man, a very good relationship, and a great just visual style. Like, the movie is beautiful to look at, but they just needed to simplify it. And unfortunately, Marc Webb wasn't able to do that, and he doesn't have a third film to really show what his full vision was for this character. Luckily though, we did get some closure, I guess, with No Way Home, but let me know what you guys think about this. How do you feel about The Amazing Spider-Man 2? This is one of those movies that people are either extremely high on or just hate it. I'm kind of in the middle, but let me know down in the comments below. How do you feel about this? And I'll see you next one. Peace.